Welcome. It's really nice to have you here this morning. These conversations are being sponsored by the Marcus J. Borg Foundation. I established this after Mark's death as an effort to encourage conversations that will help us articulate afresh in a meaningful and intellectually honest and realistic way what it means to be Christian in a 21st century world, which is very religiously and culturally pluralistic. So this conversation is sort of part of that effort to draw people together and talk about what it means to be Christian, or what it is that we believe and why, and what difference does it make. Okay. So I'm just delighted that that here in Bend that we're gathering to do this. So anyway, it's really great to see you. I want to thank Gail McGuire for sort of the title of these conversations, Into the Deep. That was her suggestion of the kind of invitation that we have here. And she's a member of Trinity Episcopal Church here, but she's also really involved in ecumenical work. But into the deep. So we get to kind of push off the shore a little bit and go into the deep waters and explore a little bit. Loosen our moorings, if you will, as needed.
You said morals, right?
Moorings.
I was just wondering.
This is a progressive group. So.
Just wanted to be clear. Yeah.
By the way, this is a little bit, Jad? Maybe not. This has a little bit of feedback in it. It's a little
hot.
It's a little hot for me. Oh, Bill, are you upstairs to do that? Okay. Is this a little, because I'm really sensitive to a certain pitch, and I'm in it.
Okay.
So unless this is a deliberate effort to kind of, Is this a little bit better? A little
Sounds
bit better?
to me. Yeah.
Okay.
Because I did hear.
It's still a little bit hot for me, though, I think. We've titled this particular conversation, Winter Landscape and Unpacking the Christmas Stories. Okay. So the shape of the day, the first part of the day, we will talk about winter landscape. I'll say more about that in just a moment. Bill will head us off. We'll take about a 15-minute break, probably at about 10:15. Okay, we'll have a 15-minute break. And then the second part of the morning, we will unpack the quote-unquote Christmas stories and talk a little bit about what they might suggest and what we make of them. Okay? So, and then we'll be done by 11:30. So that's the shape of the morning. Let me say a little bit about, in general, about winter landscape and why we decided to start the day talking about the natural terrain, but also the terrain of the narratives that coincide with the seasons of the natural year. And those are part of the seasons of the church year. For those of you who are part of liturgical churches, we've got Advent, which has certain characteristics. There are certain aspects, qualities of the season of Advent that we not only see in the natural world, but I suggest that they reflect our own inscape. It's a Gerard Manley Hopkins word. So it describes the landscape that we live in, and it is also reflective of our own inscape, things that we experience in our human journey. Okay? And in the Christian tradition, you've got Advent, which interestingly enough is the beginning of a new year. So for those of us who follow this kind of thing, it's like note that we can consider this the time of new beginnings. Now, of course, we've got January 1st. For some people, Eastertide would be new beginnings too. So we have many opportunities to celebrate that. But Advent is actually the end and the beginning of a new year. And one of the things that I really admire about the Christian tradition, and that I think it has just great wisdom, is these seasons that we celebrate during the liturgical year. because I think that they, as I said just a moment ago, that they reflect something about our own personal journeys. So I think that the seasons actually augment the narrative. The natural season augments the narrative that we hear. So I just encourage us to pay attention to that. And for instance, the season of Advent, the season of winter, if you think in sort of the natural life cycles, it's winter, but eventually spring will come. Or you're in spring, and that's lovely, and summer will follow. Or you're in summer, and, eventually the leaves are going to fall. Or you're in fall, and you'll encounter the dead of winter. Okay? So I think that these are opportunities for reflection. I also want to say that even though the liturgical year is set, we may experience these different seasons in our lives, not in terms of the calendar. I have been through the dead of winter in the middle of summer. I have been in the dead of winter and seen intimations of resurrection. Okay. I've been in summer, and it feels like early fall. Okay, you get my drift. Okay, so these are just things to think about. That this is part of the offering of the Christian calendar, which I really respect. And so we decided that this morning, the first part of the morning, that we would talk about the winter landscape and what are some of the characteristics of that, which also reflect some of the characteristics of Advent, and probably reflect some of the things about the narrative that we hear at this time of year as well. Okay? So that's how we'll get started. Before Bill leads us off, I'm going to read the Listening Hearts guidelines for conversation. And I will read these every time we get together. These are indeed guidelines. I think they are hard to honor, but I think they're really important. You'll hear them in a moment. There are 10 of them. These almost create a kind of ethos for us about how to listen and how and when to respond. Okay? So the Listening Hearts Ministries guidelines. Take time to become settled in God's presence. Listen to others with your entire self. Senses, feelings, intuition, imagination, rational faculties. Do not interrupt. Pause between speakers to absorb what has been said. Do not formulate what you want to say while someone else is speaking. Speak for yourself only, expressing your own thoughts and feelings, referring to your own experiences, and avoid being hypothetical. Steer away from broad generalizations. Do not challenge what others say. Listen to the group as a whole, to those who have not spoken aloud as well as to those who have. Generally, leave space for anyone who may want to speak a first time before speaking a second time yourself. And hold your desires and opinions, even your convictions, lightly. Good luck to us. So, Bill.
Everything I say in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, I want us to see in the context of a comment that Marianne said, that this is also about our own internal experience. It's about our relationship to the world. This whole season, in fact, every season, is in some regard recapitulated within the lives of all of us, regardless of when during the year that it happens. I think that's perhaps the central insight that we have to, which Marianne offered, that I want to emphasize, And everything else I say is fluff, I guess you could say. It's just sort of filling the time until we're ready to do something else. So let me speak specifically about the season, the winter season, the season of that corresponds in the Christian calendar with Advent. It is a time both of endings and beginnings, and it's designed that way quite purposefully. For those of you who are and how many people are from liturgical traditions, whether or not you are part of them now? Yeah, okay. So a good majority are from one liturgical type of church. Are there any people who have never had any experience of liturgical churches whatsoever here? Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you have not. Okay. So, yeah.
Okay.
But you have, or recently you've begun to. So this language of church seasons will not be completely foreign.
So it's not technical language for most of us here.
Yeah, I guess that's part of what I want to, that I'm a little bit concerned about is I don't want to be talking just to part of the group and leaving the rest of the group saying, what is that all about? Advent is that season of both beginnings and endings. And in liturgical churches, the first lessons of Advent have to do with the end of things. They have to do with the coming apocalypse. They're all couched in the apocalyptic terms, the end of the world, or the dramatic end of the world, in which evil seems for a moment to triumph, and then God wins, which is fortunate. It's a kind of a spoiler alert for most of us in these churches. But nevertheless, it is looking ahead to the consummation, really, of all things. And this very optimistic view, even though some of the imagery is horribly lurid and terribly destructive, there is this hopeful view that there is an arc to history. Whether it bends towards justice or not, I think is debatable, but there is an arc towards history that bends toward the triumph of God and the completion of everything, so that indeed life is on earth as it is in heaven. We all know right now that the problem is not with how things are in heaven. The problem is with how things are here. So there's this looking forward to great pain, great trauma, great difficulty, great sadness, great tragedy even, but also beyond all that to great fulfillment, which gives birth in all of us to a great hope. So it's about endings. It's also, of course, about beginnings, which is why at the end of Advent we celebrate in the Christian tradition at least the birth of Jesus. We celebrate the beginning, and we celebrate it in such a manner as to suggest this one beginning really provides the narrative for the whole world. That's the Christian tradition. This is the capital T beginning that we are all looking forward to. Now, let me digress here for just a second and say that the dirty little secret of Christianity is that the Jehovah's Witnesses are right. Christianity did baptize a polytheistic, what we call a pagan festival, a solstice festival. And Christianity did in fact do that, and it was done quite deliberately. It was also done late. It's 4th century, as a matter of fact. And well, we know this for a variety of reasons, but one of the dead giveaways is that around the biggest feast days of the Christian calendar, there are no other major feast days. The Easter season has 2 major feast days. And it's clear that those feast days, Holy Innocents and Stephen, were there before we started celebrating Christmas. And they were so powerful and so important that we couldn't move them out, or the folks who were in charge then couldn't move them out. So celebrating the birth of Jesus is actually, and I use this term advisedly, late. Christianity gets along for close to 300 years without celebrating the birth of Jesus. But there's a need to be discovered, not only to co-opt a polytheistic festival of the death and rebirth of the Son, but also to point this out, that we are looking forward even as we look back. Or, if you want to put it another way, looking back even as we look forward. So that this time of the year is is important to have an opportunity to do both things. To realize that we really are, our lives are purposeful. They are headed in a direction, and it's a direction that is governed by hope. It's a direction that's governed by a promise of ultimate fulfillment, a promise that will not necessarily be fulfilled in our lifetime, but that is held out for the entire world. And I'll say a little bit more about that when I talk about Matthew. This is a promise that is not just made to us specifically, me, my own private relationship with God. It's a promise and a hope that informs the direction of the entire world. And I want to emphasize something too. This does not mean that everybody becomes Christian. It does not mean that. It did not start meaning that for a very, very long time. What it means is the world will be as it was meant to be by God, whatever that is. There was no thought in the earliest trajectory of Christian history, the earliest moments when we were beginning to think about, what is this all about? That everyone would become Christian any more than the Jewish hope for the fulfillment of all things was that everybody would become an Orthodox Jew. That too is foreign to Jewish spirituality. And it was for a long time foreign to Christian spirituality. Not so foreign now, and from my point of view, that's unfortunate. But in the beginning, when people look forward to the end, the vision was of the fulfillment of all things in God. Not that everybody would stand up every Sunday and say the Nicene Creed in exactly the same way. That wasn't the vision. It was a much larger, broader, more important vision than that. And the reason that we looked for that complete fulfillment, somewhat paradoxically, was because in this baby Jesus, the hope of the world is seen. And that hope of this, invested in this Jewish peasant baby. Jewish peasant baby. I'll say that one more time. The hope invested in this Jewish peasant baby who stayed a Jew and stayed a peasant, not a baby, his whole life, was that the whole world would be healed. Okay? Jewish peasant baby. So that's the first thing I want to say about Advent. And it corresponds, does it not, as Marianne suggested, to what's physically happening in the world around us. We are at an end. In fact, driving in, I just saw the sun really at this time of year basically just kind of goes across the southern sky. It really does. It doesn't really, noon is kind of a technical term this time of year. The highest point in the southern sky is still really very far south. So things are ending. It feels like it's getting darker. It feels like things are kind of coming to their conclusion. And yet, as we also know, at the very moment when the sun feels like it's furthest away, the days start getting longer. And new life and new hope awakes. So the physical presence of Advent during winter is not an accident. The choice of celebrating Christmas, and let's face it, there's a roughly 1 in 365 chance that Jesus was born on December 25th. More or less. It might have been a leap year, so it could have been 1 in 366.
Some think he was a Pisces.
Yes. Yeah. But it turns out, right now, as far as we're concerned, he was a Capricorn. But he really, we don't really know for sure. But it wasn't an accident. It wasn't a coincidence. It was a deliberate effort. And a very successful one. And I think a brilliant and inspired effort on the part of the growing institution that becomes Christianity, to apprehend in the physical The world around us, what is going on inside us, what is going on spiritually. New birth, new life. Death, to be sure, but life as well. So let me just finish here, as though you had a choice, by suggesting what it is. I talked about what it is we're awaiting. But as we look, the consummation. But let's think about what it is we're waiting for as we celebrate Advent and in terms of preparation. We are waiting for a baby. We are not waiting for a full-grown person. We are not waiting for some hero to burst full-grown on the stage to sweep away every problem and difficulty. We are waiting for a helpless little baby who is just as helpless as every other little baby in the world. Indeed, a baby so helpless that in Matthew's narrative, the parents have to flee in order to preserve its life. So we are waiting for the vulnerable. We are waiting for the one who needs us for everything. We are waiting for the one who has no apparent resources of his own. It's terribly important for us to understand that. We're waiting for a baby. We're waiting, in other words, for a true and complete and real human being. We are not waiting for what they call in theater the deus ex machina. That's not actually what we're waiting for. It feels like that at times because our image is inevitably of the full-grown Jesus who is in command of the stage and who knows what's going on and is able to do whatever he wants. But in Advent, what we're preparing for is not that. We're preparing for a baby in whom not only is the fullness of his humanity to be emphasized, but in whom we also see the beauty of God and the presence of God. That's what we're waiting for. And so, again, think about what Marianne said. Where does that happen in you? Where do you see in your vulnerability? Where do you see in your helplessness? Where do you see in your complete lack of resources? Where do you see in your not knowing what to do next? Where in those moments in your life do you see the possibility of the presence of God? Where you find that, you are deeply, deeply, deeply in the midst of Advent. Whether it is in the middle of July or in the middle of December. So with that, I think that's anything else I say really would be fluff. So I'll quit there and turn it over to Marianne, then we'll open it up for some thoughts. But just ponder these possibilities about what Advent means. Endings, beginnings. But think about what kind of beginning. The beginning of hope, the beginning of genuine hope and purpose and meaning, born from the darkest moments of your life. Thank you.
Just going to
pause
for a moment. I'll piggyback on all of that, okay? Endings and beginnings. Okay? I think that Bill mentioned the apocalyptic imagery that sometimes accompanies the beginning of Advent, calamities and wars and all of this kind of stuff. And, when you see this coming, You know the end is near. And I think that we sometimes mistake what's coming with what's been identified as what is happening. So that, the wrathful coming of God, I think that's a misperception. What fascinates me about this endings, beginnings, and even the birth stories is that they arise at a time that is full of calamity, that is full of strife and uncertainty, and where death looms. But it's fascinating to me that in the midst of that, we are told there's another way that's possible. So the clarion call is the end of world, not the world. I think it's really important we make that distinction too. It's not the end of the world, and then another one is going to come down from heaven. I mean, frankly, think about it. That's impossible. And that's not a lack of faith that it's impossible. We know that. Okay? So I don't think that it's the end of the world and then something else is going to come from on high. That's literalizing something in a very heavy way. I suggest that it's end of world as we have known it. It invites us to think about the end of world as we have known it. Not violence, not oppression, not destruction, but we need to put an end to that kind of world and imagine another one and help to bring that into being. Okay? So end of world, not the world. And but in the midst of this struggle, as Bill was saying, that does not fell us. In the midst of that, it's like there is another way. And then it's like, and we need to do something about it. And the time is at hand for that. Okay? So that's an aspect of endings and beginnings I wanted to note. I am struck by some of the imagery that comes out of the narratives. It's a time of being pregnant, heavy with something, and not knowing exactly what is going to be born. So think of that as an image for your own journey. I remember Marcus one time talking, the whole family was together, we were having dinner, and Marcus said, it was Advent, and he said, I just feel heavy with something. And I don't know what is wanting to issue forth. But he said, I just feel heavy. And it was uncomfortable, but not oppressive heavy. But it's like there's something that I'm kind of carrying. And of course, the kids had no idea what he was talking about. They sort of looked like, hey, are you all right, Dad? But it was suggestive of something that he was experiencing. And it actually happened to be during Advent. And I kind of have a theory that when you experience some of these characteristics of the season, when you're in the season, it's even more powerful for you. So the notion of conceiving something when you don't even think it's possible, and carrying something, and waiting for it to come into view. That's kind of the season of Advent. Or and what you were saying about the darkness and our tendency to want to go to bed early, or the animals who hibernate, or let's just, I'm drowsy, I don't want to stay awake. And the watchword of Advent is stay awake. I mean, everything is encouraging you to just kind of, we'll bundle up, we'll cover up, we'll just wait this season out. And the watchword is stay awake. For night is flying. Awake, awake. So we can play with that. What does it mean to stay awake and to be alert when everything else in you is just wanting to lull you into sleep? or unconsciousness or whatever. That's interesting to me. A time to make a journey, like you were saying about, having in Matthew, we need to get out of Dodge and head to Egypt because, there's trouble in Nazareth or in Bethlehem. It's a terrible time of year to make a journey, and I think that W.H. Auden speaks to that in one of his poems. But what is it in our lives when it's a terrible time to make a journey, but we must make that journey. We must make that journey. What is that about? Another thing that we pick up from the narratives that's related to endings and beginnings in both Matthew and Luke, and by the way, there are only 2 birth stories. Mark doesn't have one, and neither does John, unless you think when John says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh. That's kind of a little birth narrative, I guess. But the actual birth stories about Jesus are in Matthew and Luke, just in those 2. In both of those narratives, they are, Herod is king. And for instance, in Matthew, I think it is, they are warned to not return to Herod.
That's correct.
Okay?
The Magi.
Now think of that. Don't return to Herod. If you think of Herod as a metaphor for empire, the oppressive dimensions of empire, one of the warnings in the Advent story is Herod is dangerous. Herod in both narratives wanted to get rid of the babies under 2 because he was afraid that this new birth was going to challenge his autonomy and power. So it's like, I want to get rid of all of that. So one of the things is like, don't return to Herod. Think about that as a metaphor. Don't go back to that way of running the world. Okay? We will ask you for some thoughts about this season as well, what you're coming up with. But these are also some aspects of the season of Advent. And I love what you said about the child, about that what is being birthed is a baby. And that's also I'd never thought about that before, but how interesting it is to know that what begins in Advent is not the full-blown thing yet. So in a sense, if you're going through Advent and something is being birthed in you, don't expect for it all to be a ready-made. There will be a process that you need to go through about the maturation of your own quote-unquote new birth. And I mean, that's just really helpful. As we unpack the narratives, more of this will kind of come into play. But do you want to comment a little bit on kind of where I'm going with this?
I don't have a lot to add other than, again, I find what you say to be very much consonant with not only my own particular feelings, but most of what is said about Advent. I just want to continue to emphasize what I guess I'd call that more existential impact of it. That the narrative, that Advent is about us. It's not just about something either that will happen in the distant future or in the distant past. In fact, if that's all it is, then I'm not sure what it has to do with us. If someone comes to me and says, the world's going to end in 10,000 years, I say to myself, well, and, we can't even get excited enough about the possibility of climate change causing problems in our own lifetime. So, and again, if someone says, well, 2,000 years ago, this neat thing happened, I say, well, yes, it was a neat thing, but what does that say? So unless it says something about who we are now and where we're going, where we're from, where we're going, what we're struggling with, what our hopes and joys are, unless it does that, then I I struggle with what the point is. It becomes a kind of quaint and quite often somewhat maudlin exercise if that's all it is. But if it's about us, then I think the potential there is remarkable. And I guess the only other thing I would add is it is about the presence of the divine coming into this world. If we don't also notice that, then I also think we're missing something. It's about the notion that what it is to be a person is the place in which the divine is manifested. And unless we notice that, and in other words, try to stop thinking dualistically, try to stop saying to ourselves, the spirit is cool, the flesh not so much. I like I like the idea of being spiritual. I kind of don't like the idea of being stuck in this physical body. The whole Judeo-Christian tradition, Judaism much more purely than Christianity, because Christianity got translated into Hellenistic dualism. But there are things we can do about that. And one of them is to think about Advent in its truest sense. That it's about the presence of God in what it means to be a real person. The presence of the divine in what it means to be created and part of creation. So I guess that's all I would add.
Yeah. And incarnation is a big deal in Christian theology, which is, incarnation, incarnate, like chili con carne and rice, It's like enfleshment. Enfleshment. So the notion of God is enfleshed.
Yeah.
And we do tend to use the language of coming down or the divine coming into us, but I think that to even push it further, I think it's in us.
Mm-hmm.
It's in us. And that doesn't, so many of us walk around like we are little gods, but that's not the point.
That's not actually what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's not quite the point. And two things that you also mentioned earlier about preparation and making room. Preparation. What does it mean, with everything that Bill has just said too, what does it mean to prepare our minds or our imaginations or our hearts or our sense of possibility? What does it mean to prepare for the fact that Herod's way is not the way? That, the world as we see it now we want to put an end to that world, but not the end of the world. What does it mean to prepare, or what does it mean to make room for the insights of Advent? What does that mean to make room? It's just something for us to continue to think about.
Right.
And even, granted that the narrative at this time of year in the Christian tradition is very much about Jesus and very much about, Jesus as being an embodiment of the light and the way and all of that. And so I agree that the narrative is about that. But I completely agree with Bill that if that narrative isn't about something beyond that, then I think we've missed it. I think we've missed the real importance of it. And that doesn't mean that we're wanting everybody to become a Christian so that they get what we're talking about. I think it's that as Christians, we have this bigger sense of what's possible. And other people can have a bigger sense of what's possible too. We talk about it through the Christian narrative. But I don't think that means that the Christian narrative is the only narrative through which this kind of hope and understanding and possibility happens. I think the Christian narrative at its best is a profound affirmation of the capacity of the human and the wonder and creativity and just a compelling move to life that is what in which we live and move and have our being. And we talk about it very specifically in terms of this narrative. But I think the narrative is about that story, and I think it's about more than that. Is that?
Yeah.
Is that fair enough to say?
To me, the remarkable thing about Jesus is that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Jewish hope from the point of view of the people who believe, right. The Jews who believe he was the Messiah. And Jesus, in doing so, burst the bonds of Judaism. I think it's extremely odd that Christianity ultimately reconfined, domesticated Jesus.
Yeah.
And said he's not about bursting the bonds of anything. He's about making new bonds. I find that to be an odd way to have gone. But it's a remarkably human way to have gone. It illustrates, I think, the failure of human imagination across the board. And it was probably inevitable. Well, it was either inevitable or it wasn't. So it wasn't probably inevitable. It was inevitable because it is what happened. But the reason why I find I'm a Christian because I was born a Christian, baptized at the less than a month old. I remain a Christian because I think this particular way of understanding what's going on focuses on a person who bursts the bonds of religion.
Yeah.
And how do I know that Jesus is the Messiah? Because he said and lived and died and rose to illustrate that God is for everybody, not just the Jews. How odd it was of us to say God isn't for anybody except the Christians. That's an odd way to interpret that, I think.
Right.
And we are fortunate to live in this moment because more and more of us are beginning to recover that notion. But what I want to suggest is, ultimately, it's at least in part an Advent notion, that the consummation we are looking forward to, actually, we are in a moment in history where we are able better to recapture that original vision than we were perhaps in the middle of the 11th century, when much of this theology was cemented. And when the only people you knew were Christians, and the only time you ever heard of people who weren't Christian was because they were they had swept across North Africa and were threatening Vienna. And at one point, a century or two later, even threatened Paris. And so that made it's understandable in that historical context that you would think, wow, if it isn't Christian, it must be terrible. So the theology that emerges from that crisis, it's not at all surprising to me that it would go that way. But that's not where we are now.
Right.
And therefore, we are in a better position to recapture that original, I think, Advent vision. That the reason why this person is so important is because he bursts the bonds of religion and is shown to be for the entire world. And takes us beyond the particularity of our own ritual and practice and dogma, all of which I think are valuable and important, and points us to that which, to the God, to the divine presence at which all of those things point. Yeah. So,
I mean, one of the reasons Jesus got executed was that he said God can be found outside the temple. God is accessible to all.
That certainly annoyed the people. Yes,
yeah.
That was an annoying thing to insist upon.
And right now, it makes the church shudder.
Oh yeah.
Because I think that much of the wisdom of life can be found outside the church. Mm-hmm. There was a time where they said there is no salvation.
Oh yes.
Outside the church.
Salvation outside the church.
Well, that is no longer so.
Right.
So I really appreciate what you're saying, that in some ways we have a way of claiming some of these symbolic narratives more freely now, because we live in a very different worldview than the 11th century or the first.
Yeah.
We know a whole lot more. And I would suggest that modernity and postmodernity is not giving more breadth to secularism. I actually don't believe that. I think what it is doing is helping us call the question on what we believe and why.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
On what we believe and why. And it's calling us to re-examine a lot of things that we've been saying sort of by rote.
Yeah.
And maybe reframe and, to use a word you just did, reimagine what is this stuff really about that can really help us in the living of our days. Okay, so and that in that regard, it's
Just wondering how we're doing on.
I think it's time to yeah. So, what I'm going to give us a minute of just silence, and you can help me articulate this, Bill. But sit with what we've heard and what we're wondering about. But I think the invitation is thinking about Advent and some of the themes and dimensions we've been describing. Where have you experienced that in your own journey? Like, is what we're describing, it's like, yes, I know what you're talking about. I know what the season of Advent is about. I've been there. I've experienced this part of Advent. And maybe knowing that, it also puts a kind of frame or context in terms of what we're experiencing in a, to use a phrase, in a broader narrative for our own lives. I think it can be real perspective for us. Yeah. But where have you experienced some of the characteristics of Advent? Do you want to put that more
I think
clearly?
that's fine. That's
okay.
That's what I'm really.
Okay.
That's the discussion. That's what I'm interested in hearing.
Okay. So I'm going to give us a minute of silence. At the end of that minute, I'm going to ring the bell, and then we'd love to hear from as many of you as we can in the next 15 minutes. Okay. Is that clear? Clear enough? Okay. So at the end of a minute, I'll ring the bell.
I believe that Jed has the microphone,
okay.
So if you would be willing to raise your hand, and not simply to get the floor, but to get Jed's attention. I think Chris might.
And we'll try to have some gender balance here.
Yes.
I think there's an anticipation for in sort of a holy moment with the first snow. And it marks the true death of the growing season for a while, and all the things underneath that are waiting till later when they can come back.
That's a good insight.
Of the first snow, you said.
Well,
I'm holding off in case a man raises his hand.
I think it's the men know that. The men
good.
know that, so we have. Oh, okay. All right.
Ken, you're reliable.
Which is probably about the only reason. I typically have a word du jour that I wear out over a period of time, then I find a new one. And the word human tends to weigh on me now, in that, and I think you mentioned it, Bill, we're only human. And for some reason, the word personhood came into the discussion too, and I'm wondering if I, among others, need to transition from being human as an excuse for messing up, when being human is really a good deal. But culturally, we use it a little bit off kilter. I'm wondering if personhood, or being a person, might modify my thinking to the extent that in Advent, thinking in terms of Advent, reframe human into person and give me a little more opportunity to do good.
Let me say that I like the term human, and I agree with you that that's a good critique of the way I use the term in that one moment. I like human better than personhood, only because human comes from the word humus, soil, dirt, fertile, good soil. They're the same root. And I like that idea that we come from the earth. But I also accept your critique that we shouldn't go around saying to be human is simply to goof it up all the time.
Right.
Because that is only half of what it means to be human. So I accept your critique, even though I like the poetry and imagery of the word human more than I like the poetry and imagery of the word person, but I completely accept your critique of that.
I just wanted to say that when we started out talking about soil and stuff, get into more organics of what the season is about. And for me, I always kind of dreaded fall and things were dying off and dropping to the ground and all this kind of stuff. Well, actually, it's the beginning. It's the seed going into the soil. It stays there in a fairly dormant state. Things are going on all the time. That is the cycle. That's the beginning of the cycle.
And have you had that experience in your own life where stuff seems to be falling apart or falling down, and yet realizing in retrospect,
it's mostly kind of an ending, but then I think there's a resting time too, and then start going again.
Okay.
And I know we had a thought here,
yeah.
And unless another man goes right now, I think we owe this person whose name I don't know.
Yes, right here.
So as you were speaking, I really realized that an experience was an Advent story. This is kind of a personal experience. About 4.5 years ago, I realized that, all the theology I've been reading, looking for the golden key, the work that I threw myself into, trying to give myself my life meaning, that just was not where it was at. I was never going to find the golden key in all this reading, or ever going to find meaning in these activities I threw myself into. And that left me in this really empty, dark space. And I had to start living differently and, give birth to something new. And so that infant is now about 4 years old, if I think about that. So, not very articulate yet. That's
wonderful. It speaks to a number of things that both of us said, but that world ended, and it wasn't terribly pleasant.
And then to think, how can this be that that something else can happen?
Yeah.
Because, letting go of all that stuff. So it's like, how can it be that maybe something more will happen? Yeah. That's very Advent. I'm quoting from Mary, actually.
Yes. You are indeed. Yay!
I like to put quotes on my emails, and I'll leave it there for 4 or 5 weeks. And one that I saw several weeks ago, and it was sort of like, when it's darkest and you think you've been buried, maybe you've been planted.
There you go.
Wow, nice.
I had not that had never occurred to me, but that fits perfectly the thematic concerns we've got here. Yeah.
Wow.
That's really good.
Yeah, thank you.
Maybe you've just been planted, not buried.
Boy, that came up just in time. Thank you.
I consider myself, I get tearful, a post-Christian, believing agnostic, seminary trained with the Presbyterians, discerned not to take ordination for part of the reason that I knew I was on my way out of Christianity. That was, a couple decades ago. But what I want to speak to is how timely it is to be here today. Just in the last couple months, I've had a homesick feeling for the scriptures. They had wallpapered my interiority. I used to recite scriptures as I was walking to school or singing hymns. I don't necessarily feel like I'm on my way back into the church. I don't know that matters. I'm not opposed to it. I mean, I work for the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship, so, it's a complex sort of thing. But I just want to speak to the longing that has come almost like a shooting star that it's like I see a glimpse, and I haven't sat down with my old dog-eared Bible or anything, but I just want to speak to this sense of making room. And I had a question, just about historical stuff, and I thought, Shayla, just stay in the inners. So I just want to say thank you, and I do just have that feeling of what's happening inside. It's it's really big.
If I can add to that, it's like going home by another way.
Yeah.
Going home, but by another way.
We need to stop here for a moment.
Maybe.
Yeah. What a wonderful image, though. Yeah. Well, so we have a few more minutes, I think.
Yeah, we do. So I'm an artist, and so the visual is always really important to me, and poetry and symbolism. And a few weeks ago, I was fortunate to be in a church in Évora, Portugal, and I'd heard about it. The interior of the church is all furnished or designed with skulls and bones, and I was a little hesitant to go because it's sort of an odd, concept to imagine this wall completely covered with skulls and bones. But it was so beautiful. It was so beautiful. And they were quite, the designs the way that they'd used the femur bone, like on end. I mean, you start to notice, like a paintbrush, how they had used these, different bones of the body. And I came away with this it's like it really took a piece of fear away from me about death. And then 6 years ago, my sister jumped off the Ross Island Bridge in Portland and died. And since then, since being in Évora in that interior of that church, she's been visiting me through music, which is very, very sweet. So this time of year, I almost feel like there's a thin veil, more of a thin veil. So I just wanted to say that. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we the West, and I mean America, we seem to have a really hard time with death. I've even heard people talk about if I die.
That might have been me last Wednesday.
Maybe that was you. Yeah, that was. And one has, but a lot of older cultures have kind of figured this part of it out, and therefore are able to confront it in a way that it's hard for us here to do. And you see the healthful benefit of that in your own life and spread it in your own story.
I love, though, what you're saying about that thin, the Celts call it the thin place. Yeah. But that there are times, I think, when that membrane between life and death and what can be seen and not seen gets very almost transparent. And when that happens, I think that we don't worry so much about heaven or here or whatever. There's something happens that I don't know if our molecules know that we really belong to all of it. But something happens. There's an awareness of some kind, even though we may not be able to really talk about it. But it sounds like something like that happened with your sister in this season. Yeah.
My need to walk around provides that space between comments.
Thank you, Jed.
I know that.
I know, and that's why I didn't go with her.
Well, you know what they say? All things are cured by walking. That's Augustine. There we go.
Marianne, you talked about staying awake and being still in the hibernation and the paradox of that. And that makes me crazy. Not what you said makes me crazy, but trying the openings and the closings and the chaos that's involved in living that. Yeah. There's a question in here. How do I do that? No. Staying awake for me sometimes is painful.
Very much so.
So putting that together with I need to be still, and sometimes I need to hibernate, is sometimes, not sometimes, is almost an everyday living. And maybe I'm no different from anybody else. Thank you.
Yeah. I think it was Robert Frost who had this great comment. He said, Christ came to make a break with logic. Isn't that a great little phrase? You know? So, paradox, break with logic, it's like, it's painful sometimes to stay awake. And sometimes I need to just go to sleep. It's restorative. So we live in this tension. And we have to discern sometimes, when is it just like, it's more restorative for me to go to sleep? And when is the call, stay awake?
I have a thought about that as well, Nori. I can tell the difference between when I'm checking out in order to be more able to deal with life as it actually is later, and when I'm checking out because I just don't want to have to deal with life at all.
Yeah.
I can actually tell the difference. Not always in the moment, but in retrospect, I can always tell the difference. And so what I want to say is, in terms of what we're talking about, our theme here, is when we are checking out simply because we can't stand it anymore and we just want to get away and run away and hope that when we wake up it'll all be better. That's not helpful. When we are checking out because we realize we have a larger task that we can't do right now, but just might be able to do if we just stop for a moment, then I think we're doing something good and helpful for ourselves. So that's how and as I say, in my own life, I can tell the difference. And the preponderance for me is on running away. Oh no, Mr. Bill! is ceaselessly playing in my head. But I can tell the difference. And so I want to say something. There's something very important about checking out when you are doing it as part of a larger, I don't want to say strategy, but as part of a larger movement towards completion and health.
We might have time for one more before we have our break.
I've just been really aware of, maybe always, of depression in this season with all the darkness.
Yeah,
and
right.
boy, it's scary. And this year I've been spending time at Sageview with a close family member. And I guess what I've been liking is the baby imagery, the vulnerable baby. I think we're good at that with kids and with babies, but not so good with adults. That vulnerable baby is in each of us. The peasant baby. And so during the season, to see that in each other, and then the struggle for me too has been Christmas Day. I feel like the flower is supposed to be there, but your imagery about the seed being planted, Christmas Day isn't supposed to be the full flower. So, oh, thank God I don't, because I always think, why am I not happier on Christmas? You know? Oops. So to just, I don't know, somehow help each other. No, you can just be a little root. You don't even have to be above the ground yet, maybe on Christmas Day.
That's right.
To give each other permission for that.
That's a really, you've made a very important mental health point. I'm not a mental health professional and never have been. But I have read some studies which suggest that depression, even suicide, is much more common. And I think there are two reasons for that. One is seasonal affective disorder actually is more widespread than we think it is. And second is you've got a bunch of people saying you're supposed to be happy right now. What is more oppressive than people telling you, it's Christmas, be happy, it's the happiest time of the year? No, it isn't for some people. Stop that. And the pressure that we create on ourselves by buying into what our society says can be literally deadly. And so and as I say, and when you add seasonal affective disorder in the Northern Hemisphere to that, you can have a toxic combination. And so we can't change the way that Earth rotates around the sun. That's kind of not our job. But we can stand up for ourselves and say, I will be exactly as happy as I feel like being. Thank you very much. And I don't need to apologize to that or explain it to anybody. If all I am is a little tiny bit of root underneath the ground right now, great. I'm glad you're a full-blown chrysanthemum or whatever it is. Good for you. But I'm not there yet. And I don't need to apologize or explain. I'm not there yet.
Yeah,
it's an important issue.
Yeah, so helpful. And there's so much about this season culturally. It's such a distraction from everything we've been talking about. So in a sense, what we're talking about is countercultural.
Right.
To what's going on elsewhere.
Yes, we are.
And in terms of the natural world, it's also, it's just the opposite. And there's a terrible undertow in this season. And I don't know what it is about this season that I think loss speaks to loss, grief speaks to grief, and of family time and all this kind of stuff. It's awful. And my growing up in Christmas, it was awful. Yeah. So it's like, I'm a pastor, so it's like, joy to the world.
Right. And what is more fun than spending 5 days in a single house with your family of origin?
Yes, with my mother smoking her cigarettes and drinking her bourbon, and it's awful. So
that's just more fun than I can handle.
So exactly. So this is a sensitive, difficult season.
We're getting off track a little bit.
So heck, I think it's time for us to take a little break now.
Stimuli is just excited all kinds of stuff.
Have a little break. So mingle a bit, get to know each other, be curious about each other. Like, why are you here? Yeah. And by the way, there is a sign up if you want to be on the Marcus Borg newsletter list. Yeah. There's a sign up there that we'd love to do that.
Right.
So anyway, I'll ring the bell at 10:30 to pull us back together. But anyway, mingle, enjoy, and be curious about each other.
Yeah.
The second part of the morning, we're going to unpack the quote-unquote Christmas stories. I think you have a word to say about Christmas stories.
Yeah, I call them the birth narratives.
Right.
But
so
that's just me being picky and snooty.
Bill is going to lead us off.
Okay. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to chat a little bit, or talk a little bit about Matthew's birth narrative, and Marianne here will talk about Luke's birth narrative. What you will see is our Christmas story. They really are alike in one important regard. They both talk about the birth of Jesus. They are profoundly different. And I am keenly aware of the fact that talking about these stories is really dangerous, because there are many, many, many people, and I'm sure that it is true that there are many people in this room now who are invested in the what's called the historicity of these stories. That is to say, they really happened that way, didn't they? And I have to say, I'm not going to argue with anybody about that, but truth in advertising, I do not believe that they happened that way. I think what we know about the actual historical birth of Jesus is told to us by St. Paul in the Romans. Born a woman, born under the law, which means he's born Jewish. That's what we know about the birth of Jesus, as far as I'm concerned. These stories have something very different in mind going on than to describe to us, as a newspaper account might, of how Jesus was born. Indeed, they are different enough that they can't both be historically correct. If one is, the other can't be. And we'll draw that out a little bit. But I also, in a more positive vein, besides just wrecking everything for you, at least for some of you.
Yeah, Merry Christmas.
yeah, Merry Christmas. Yeah. Go talk to Kimberly about this time of year. Is to attempt to suggest what they are actually trying to do, which my belief is far more important than simply telling us what happened. And they have two different things they're saying. Go ahead.
No. I just didn't hear your last phrase.
More important. What they're trying to do is more important than simply telling us what happened.
Okay.
It's more important than that. Matthew's narrative. Matthew is the overwhelming majority of scholars. In fact, I don't know any who don't believe this. Are convinced that Matthew was an Orthodox Jew. He was a Jew who carefully, like Paul, carefully observed all of the law, and believed profoundly as well that Jesus was the Messiah. He believed both of those things, the promised Messiah. And his entire gospel was designed both in terms of its structure, which most scholars argue is a recapitulation of the first 5 books of the Bible, to illustrate this truth, to proclaim this good news and the good news is this, to you Orthodox Jews, in Jesus, the God of the Jews has been shown to be the God of the entire world. That is what Matthew is trying to tell us, is proclaiming pretty much from start to finish. And it's particularly clear here in the birth narratives. One of the techniques, all of the evangelists, all of the Gospels use this technique of what we would call today proof texting. Matthew does it more than any of them. It's hard for him to get 2 sentences onto his pen before he says, "This was to fulfill what was written by the prophet," blah, et cetera, et cetera. So I just want to go through this first birth narrative and show you how often that happens and what Matthew is trying to do with it. We begin, for example, with what we call the story of the Annunciation. Angel comes to Mary. Mary is a bit confused about this, but nevertheless, she says, okay. Or excuse me, I got confused.
Yeah,
the angel comes to Joseph.
Right. Mary
the angel
does
goes
not
to Mary
have
and
speaking
Luke.
role in Matthew.
Yeah. Mary is not quite a cipher, but Mary is not. The angel comes to Joseph and tells Joseph, by the way, your wife, your fiance is going to have a baby, but don't worry, because this baby is the Son of the Most High, and you need to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. That doesn't make a lot of sense to us in English. It makes a lot of sense in Hebrew. Then he says, then Matthew ends that little section by saying, all of this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet Isaiah. And he quotes Isaiah 7:14 from the Greek Bible, the Septuagint version translation of it. Look, the virgins shall conceive and bear a son. All right? And they shall call him Emmanuel. I thought his name was Jesus. Okay, again, doesn't make a lot of sense to us in English. Made a lot of sense in both Aramaic and in Hebrew. So he's quoting Isaiah from the Greek version. The reason we know he's quoting Isaiah from the Greek version to begin with is because the Hebrew, and this is almost 100% of the Hebrew I know, the Hebrew uses the term, Isaiah uses the term alma to describe the miracle that's going to happen. The woman, and that just simply means in Hebrew, a young girl of marriageable age. That's what an alma is. And the miracle that Isaiah is talking about is they're going to name the baby God with us. The miracle's in the name. This is just a woman who's going to have a baby, and they're going to name this baby God with us. Matthew, following the Greek version, says the miracle is the virgin birth. Understanding rather well the Septuagint, or the Greek version, misunderstanding, as the Greek version does, the Hebrew version. So, Joseph comes out of his dream, and he does as the angel of the Lord commanded him. No sex until she had borne a son, and they named him Jesus. So, that's the first thing, is that a miracle brought upon us by God begins this whole narrative. Then we go on. Matthew does exactly the same thing. Jesus is born, all it says is in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, wise men, magi, came from the east. Where is this child who has been born King of the Jews? So there is no further narrative about the birth of Jesus in Matthew's gospel. All it says is after he had been born. There's no stable. There's no shepherds. There's no angelic chorus. No nothing in Matthew's version of this. And the reason is very simple. Joseph and Mary live in Bethlehem. That is their home. Unlike Luke's narrative, where they lived to begin with in Nazareth, the home of Joseph and Mary is Bethlehem. And we know this because the sages go to Herod, who's a bit upset about hearing about a king being born, a la Marianne's moment, and say, well, of course we know where this baby was born. Because we are able to quote the prophet. And so what they do is they quote Micah. And you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. That's how we know Jesus was born in Bethlehem. That's how we know where his parents live. That's how we know he is there right now. So, this gets Herod upset. And he decides, okay, I have a cunning plan. I'll tell the Magi to go to Bethlehem, and then I'll tell them to come back to me and make sure that I know where he is so I can go get him. All right. This, again, is all about the fulfillment of a prophetic word, which is a tragic word. The Magi go. They adore Jesus. And here again, we see prophecy fulfilled. Because Isaiah, I believe, I took some notes. Yeah, it's Isaiah 60. Isaiah 60, the third verse. Nations shall come to your light. Kings to the brightness of your rising. And then, 3 verses later, in the 6th verse of chapter 60, they say, these are the gifts they're going to bring. Gold and frankincense. That's Isaiah. This whole story is being structured around Isaiah. Now, I know people get grumpy with me when I say this and say, why isn't it genuinely fulfilled prophecy? And I say, I just doubt it. I do not think this is prophecy fulfilled. I think this is prophecy historicized, is what I really think is going on here. And the same thing's going to be happening in Luke. So the Magi go, and they visit him in fulfillment of a prophecy. That the whole world is going to acknowledge this baby as the Messiah, as the one. Kings will come to the brightness of your rising. This is what's going to happen. And so they do. And they bring the gifts that Isaiah talks about. Matthew adds a third gift, which is, I think, absolutely brilliant. Myrrh, a burial spice. Thereby foreshadowing the end of the story. Or at least what appears to be, for a moment, from the point of view of the world, the end of the story. So, Isaiah mentions only gold and frankincense. Matthew adds myrrh because he's a brilliant storyteller. Frankly, he really, really, really knows what he's doing here. So, again, it's this whole image, this whole story of the visit of the Magi is about what the prophets talked about. And again, he's proof texting. He's cherry-picking in the most remarkable way, taking little tiny snippets and constructing a narrative around them. They leave, but they are concerned because they've been warned in a dream, just exactly as Joseph was approached in a dream. The Magi are warned in a dream, and indeed, they go home by another way. This gets Herod really annoyed. So Herod orders the death of all the children, all the male children born in the region of Bethlehem within the last 2 years. Why 2 years? Why do you think 2 years? Because that's how long it has been since Jesus was born. They live in Bethlehem. It's not surprising. And so this is not just a 12-day thing. It's a 2-year deal. That's why Herod wants to make sure we're just going to clean this up very nicely. And so they are warned to flee to Egypt. Also, of course, through the vehicle of the dream. And they escape. They run away. Again, to fulfill a prophecy, this time Jeremiah. A voice in Ramah. Rachel lamenting her children because they are no more. That's what was going to happen. It had nothing to do, that particular passage had nothing to do with the advent of the Messiah. But again, because Matthew is not just a good, but a brilliant storyteller, he adds this tragic element. And he proof texts it from Scripture. This is Matthew, I think, being a creative genius. This is not just a guy who's done his research and is telling you a story. He is a creative genius. So they run to Egypt, and the reason to run to Egypt is easy. Because Egypt is the place where Hosea says, out of Egypt have I called my son. Hosea's prophecy is talking about the whole nation of Israel. That's what he's talking about. He's talking about Exodus story, Exodus narrative. He's not talking about the Messiah coming out of Egypt. That's an idea that could not possibly have occurred to Hosea. But Matthew uses that text in this remarkably creative way in order to suggest that in Jesus is recapitulated the whole people of the nation. That's what he's doing there. Again, this guy is not just good, he is brilliant. And he's speaking, remember, his audience, a Jewish synagogue audience, who he's trying to convince that Jesus is the Messiah. And this is how he's doing it, in a way that they can understand. And so finally, after Herod dies and his son is gone as well, because they're still worried about him, they go to Nazareth. They are told once again, advised once again, via dream, that it's safe to go to Nazareth. Also, remarkably enough, uses Matthew in fulfillment of prophecy. He shall be called a Nazarite. Now, Matthew is really stretching there. But a Nazarite is a male son who is dedicated to God at birth. And so he wants that. It's also true, and I didn't know this until I looked it up, that the term Nazareth, Nazarene, has to do also with being separated out. And it means it's a term that also refers to a branch. So he's also quoting some other passages. In fact, I think I wrote them down. I hope I did. Judges 13:17 talks about a branch, a root, a branch coming out of Jesse. And then Isaiah 11 and Isaiah 53 again talk about this. A branch that shall be brought out. There's evidently, said my little book, my little footnote, which you could look up yourself, a similarity in sound as well as meaning between an Aramaic word for branch and the Hebrew town name, Nazareth. So again, Matthew is stretching here. He's really reaching. But he wants every single step of this narrative, every single bit of this narrative, to point in a single direction. That in this baby, the God of the Jews has been shown to be the God of the entire world. In this baby, we see the hope of Israel fulfilled. And he's saying that to his Jewish audience. He is not talking to Gentiles. He is not talking to anybody but his Jewish audience, working to demonstrate to them that here we have the fulfillment of our greatest hopes, our ultimate hope, has been fulfilled in this person, which is a tall order. And it's something that Matthew was not entirely successful at, as he demonstrates, well, as history itself demonstrates, but as we discover the frustration Matthew is experiencing later in his gospel, in which he tells this wonderful story of the psychopathic king who gives a party, and when people say, no, I can't go, no, I don't want to go, he has them all killed. Because when he sent his servants to remind them of the party, they killed the servants. Now, this is a weird group of people. So they kill I've been invited to parties before. I don't shoot the person who sends me the invitation. That just is not something, I've done a lot of bad things, but that's not something I've done. But that's what happens here.
I'm really glad to hear that, because he's coming to dinner in another week.
Yes, I am. Later on. Yeah. No, I can't go. And if you come to remind me, that's it for you.
Jeannie, would you call me the day after?
Yeah, exactly. Just to make sure everyone's still alive. This is an allegorical representation of the frustration and the fear and the difficulties that Matthew is experiencing as an Orthodox Jew trying to convince his people and not doing it. And they killed Jesus, they killed Stephen, they killed other Christian witnesses, and this isn't working the way I want it to. And then the end of that story is even more remarkable. There's this guy who gets in, but he doesn't have the right garment. There's this guy who gets in, he doesn't have the right garment on. He doesn't have the proper wedding garment. And so the host, who we already know is a little kooky, says to him, you don't have the right garment on. So rather than saying, you're going to have to leave, he has him bound and gagged and thrown into the outer darkness. That's what I do when people dress inappropriately. But why does he do that? This is a guy who's in the party because clearly he's a figure for people who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, but they're not willing to become Jewish. He is a figure for the Paul-type Christians. And Matthew is clearly upset by that. Matthew thinks that's a failure of the mission. Matthew is wrong in this regard, as history demonstrates. He's wrong in this regard in one important way. He's right in another. I think it's still a shame that Christianity wasn't able to remain a sect of Judaism, but there were good people on both sides. Let's just say that. There were good people on both sides of that. Yeah.
That's terrible.
And there really were. So Matthew, an Orthodox Jew, trying to tell his people that in this baby, the hope of the world, the hope of the Jewish hope has been fulfilled. And it's been fulfilled for the benefit not just of us, but of everybody. A remarkable statement. Now, Luke is saying something a little bit different, something that might be considered, I suppose, in some regard, a bit more political in the way that we often think of politics, because there's a more definite clash in terms of language, titles, and so forth in Luke's account than there is in Matthew's. Matthew is not really deeply concerned, I can't see, with opposing Rome. I can't see in Matthew's gospel the same kind of statement that Luke seems to be making, with his emphasis on the people he emphasizes and so forth, and the titles that are used for Jesus, and the way the angels operate, and shepherds operate, and so forth. Matthew has a very specific idea in mind. This baby fulfills everything we hope for, people. We need to believe in him. We're not losing our Jewishness, but we need to believe in him. That's what Matthew is saying to his Jewish audience. And he does not entirely succeed. And as he writes his Gospels, probably in the 9th decade of the 1st century of the Common Era, he is increasingly beset by the fact, this is an argument I'm losing. This is something that isn't working out. And it gets back to this Advent thing. Am I being buried or planted? And Matthew feared he was being buried, I think, when the truth was he was being planted. But that's Matthew's purpose in the birth narrative, and it's a purpose that guides the writing of his entire gospel. So, did it really happen that way? No, I don't think so. I think he historicized prophecy in a way that everybody did. In a way, frankly, that Virgil did. In a way that Livy did 2 centuries before. In a way that Sallust did. In a way that a lot of people in the Mediterranean basin talked about the genius and greatness of Rome. They weren't historians either, at least not in the modern sense. He was doing something that was not only common, it was pretty much the standard way of proclaiming, of bringing your message. Whether it be about the genius of Rome or about the appearance of Emmanuel, God with us. That's enough of that.
Okay. I'm going to make a couple little comments about that. I agree with you that Matthew is a brilliant storyteller, and a question always I think to ask in reading the gospel stories is, why is the story told this way? Okay. What's really, and I'm just going to underscore this, put this a slightly different way. Matthew, who writes in probably about 80, CE.
Most people argue that, yes.
Yeah, around
Sure.
80. So think about this. This is like 60 years, 50 years after Jesus was executed. 50 years after Jesus was executed. Now, even though the gospel stories are written in first-person narrative, like I was there, these are all retrospective. So Matthew is writing around 80, 85, something like that. He knows the Jewish scripture really, really, really well. As you were saying, he's a devoted Jew. He brilliantly pulls together Jewish text and weaves it together into his story to say to his community, Jesus is the one. So I agree with you that this is not prophecy fulfilled. But I think that what Matthew is doing is he's taking texts from the past, bringing them into the present and saying, this is the fulfillment. It's a slightly different thing. Rather than saying Isaiah is talking about Jesus, I don't think so.
No, I don't know that Matthew would say, I'm agreeing with you.
But that Matthew is using some of Isaiah's language to say, you know what, the prophets of old have talked about this one who's coming. And now I'm telling you that he's the one. And I'm going to quote Isaiah to make my case. Or I'm going to quote Micah to make or Hosea to make my case. So it's retrospective. It's not prophecy. It's not Isaiah saying Jesus is coming. It's Matthew saying, in retrospect, I'm going to use that part of our ancient story to make a case for why Jesus is the one. You get the distinction? Okay? Okay.
Right.
Matthew also, and you're so right about the five, there are 5 sections in Matthew, the number 5 books of the Old Testament. Well, Jesus is the new Moses for Matthew. And even the fact that he has Jesus fleeing to Egypt and being threatened by Herod, Moses was threatened by Pharaoh and had to find refuge because Pharaoh was going to kill all the infant boys. So there are parallels in the story that, as you were saying so well, Matthew's audience would totally get those references or those analogies. And it's like, this kind of sounds like the Moses story. And so Jesus, in some ways, is the new Moses. He does, Jesus gives the Sermon on the Mount rather than the law from Sinai. By the way, when in Luke, the Beatitudes or whatever is given on the plain.
Right.
It's not on a mountain. So why does Matthew put Jesus on a mount to talk about it's actually the intensification of the commandments? It's an intensification. It's an internalization of the commandments. Okay? It's not just, don't kill your neighbor, but if you have bad thoughts about your neighbor, that's not a good thing. That kind of thing. It's an intensification. So Matthew has Jesus being a new Moses, giving this intensification of the law on a mount as a kind of a new Mount Sinai. All of this is absolutely fascinating way of speaking to his audience in images that his audience is going to understand as, Jesus is the one that we have all been talking about for all of this time.
All of this time.
So
Years,
he's brilliant about that. I disagree with you that Matthew is not political. I think both Luke and Matthew are very anti-imperial. Because there's all of the stuff about Herod in Matthew, okay? There are the titles attributed to Caesar, to the Emperor Caesar, Lord, Prince of Peace, Son of God, Born of a Virgin, Redeemer, Savior. Those were all titles given to the Caesar. Those are titles saying, this guy was like Noah. He was a son of God. You know, he's so remarkable that his father must have been a god. I mean, this kind of goes from old Greek mythology stuff too. But so the titles attributed to Caesar, the early Christian community uses those titles and attributes them to Jesus. That is totally subversive. Who is the Son of God? Is it Caesar or is it Jesus?
Is it this guy?
Who's the bringer of peace? Is it Caesar, who's going to go via violence? Or is Jesus the Son of Peace, who goes by a different way? Who's really the Redeemer of the world? Is it the Pax Romana of the Emperor Caesar? Or is it what Jesus is talking about? You know? And this is another reason that Jesus got executed. And Matthew talks about that Jesus is the new King of the Jews. And this is, as you said so well, Herod thought, nope, I am. What is this stuff? Here are these wise men saying that they have heard that there's this new King of the Jews. Not over my dead body. Okay? So the Matthew's whole import is to say that Jesus is indeed the King of the Jews that we've been waiting for. And that he is the Son of God, the Prince of Peace, the Savior, all of this. Not Caesar. And that's very consistent in both Gospels. So I would suggest that Matthew is I would use the language anti-imperial, which is another way of saying in our parlance, political.
Yeah.
Who's in charge? How are they doing it? Who's running the show? And that the early Christian community is saying, you know, the way of Caesar, the way of Rome is not the way of the kingdom of God. That's the kingdom of Caesar. And it's a totally different agenda and process and way of being with one another. Okay? So Matthew's gospel is so interesting, but his emphasis is on Jesus being king, in my opinion, or the new Moses, fulfillment of the Jewish prophecies in retrospect. Mary does not have a speaking role. Joseph is the one that's, and by the way, his lineage in Matthew goes back to Abraham,
right,
the great father of our faith. In Luke,
it goes back to Adam,
right, who was the first Son of God. In Matthew, he's really making a case. Both lineages have him be part of the king, part of the ancestry of David, okay, King David. But Matthew's emphasis is on Jesus as part of the kingly lineage, and Luke's is much more about that Jesus is one of the prophets. So it's a slightly different emphasis in terms of how they portray. But again, is it history? No. It's more, and I love how you put it, it's like prophecy historicized. Okay? And I would even suggest that some of these narratives are more metaphors historicized, you know, or analogies historicized. They're making it sound like this is how it was. But I'm with you. I don't think that their hearers ever would have thought that this is actual historical reporting. It's like, why is the story told this way? Mm-hmm. Because
Right.
this is the
That's a
meaning.
good question.
This is
That's
the
an important
meaning.
question.
What is the meaning of these stories? Not so much their historicity, but what is the meaning of these stories? And Matthew does a brilliant job
Right.
of covering everything that you
Indeed,
talked
what's
about.
the meaning of this person?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this person for us. Okay. Now Luke is totally different. Luke, and it's right. In Matthew, it's the star. It's still a light in the dark, okay, but it's a star that leads them. It's the Magi. It's the wise men. He's born in a house. In Luke, it's the angels in the night sky that illuminate the sky, the singing of the angels. In Luke, he's born in a manger in Bethlehem, okay? And I love this, thinking of, Matthew is brilliant with cleverness of language, but think of this. Bethlehem means, Beit Lehem means house of bread. Bread.
Beit Lechem.
House of bread.
House of bread.
So think of how brilliant it is that Luke, not a half-baked storyteller himself,
Very good storyteller.
that Luke says that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, house of bread, in a manger. What is a manger? It is a feeding trough. A feeding but a feeding trough. So the image is Jesus is actually going to be food for our journey. I mean, it's a brilliant way of. Luke does it differently about why is he important. Luke has his own. Matthew does. Luke has his own way of saying, okay, this person is really going to be bread for our journey. Luke has the shepherds be the ones who are told of the birth of the one. With you, it's the wise men.
The Magi, yeah.
And some in our Christmas passions have them being the three kings. Okay? But it's sort of like the wise men know wise men. It's like, so Matthew has wise men being the ones who are talking about the birth. Luke does this incredibly subversive thing. Luke has the message of the coming of Jesus go to shepherds. Well, in the first century world, shepherds were outcasts. They were marginalized. They were not considered, they were the lowest of the low. I mean, to be really, really crass here, they're out in the fields a lot with these sheep. You never know what they're going to be up to. I mean, can you take that off the tape? Actually, I think, but they were considered an outcast class. Luke has the message of the coming of Jesus going to shepherds, the marginalized, the poor, those who have no standing in the social class. And they're the ones that get the first news. That's very, very subversive. Okay. And also in Luke, Herod is the rival imperial authority that is doing things in completely the opposite way of what all the Gospels talk about, which is the kingdom of God, which was Jesus' primary message. What would this all look like if we had a different understanding of the nature and character of God? How would we be with one another if we really had a sense of what and who, if you will, is God? Okay. And just to underscore what I said a minute ago, the contrast between the kingdom of Caesar and the kingdom of God could not be more stark. Don't go back to Herod. It could not be more stark. And that's what the Gospels are about. It's about a rival kingships. Okay? The other thing, lots of stuff about Luke, but what's also interesting about Luke is that he emphasizes the role of women. And in Matthew's Gospel, and to a Jewish audience, women couldn't have testimony. Their word had no value in the public sphere because, you know where the word testimony comes from?
Cojones.
I don't know Spanish, but I think that's the Spanish translation for testes.
Uh-huh.
Women could not make testimony because they didn't have the equipment to make a statement. And, let me do this, forgive me for this. Stand up for a second.
We didn't rehearse this.
We did not. We don't rehearse this very carefully. You know the handshake? Okay? So if you make a gentleman's agreement, it's like, hey, brother, I've got you by. Okay? So it's like, okay, this is much better. Wouldn't you much rather have this than, okay? So it's like, okay, we're agreed on this.
Yeah, okay.
But,
I didn't know that.
So that's...
I didn't know that. I heard a different story.
That's I don't know where I learned that, but it wasn't in seminary. But it's like, so women couldn't make testimony because they didn't have the equipment.
Right.
So Luke has women be an important part of the birth narratives from the get-go. The first 2 chapters of Matthew, the first 2 chapters of Luke are kind of the birth narrative thing. He starts out with Elizabeth and Zechariah. Yeah. And what is so fascinating about that is that Elizabeth was old in her age, and she was barren. So here's Luke. I mean, Matthew has a totally different strategy for getting his audience engaged in how important this is. Luke's strategy, as I said, totally different from Matthew's. Luke has Elizabeth, old, Zechariah, we're past the childbearing years, and in an annunciation to Zechariah, he is told, your wife's going to conceive. And he himself says, well, how can this be? And he doesn't believe it. So he's made mute until it all happens. But think about the fact that Luke is starting his gospel by empowering someone, Elizabeth and Zechariah, into something they thought was not possible. And by gosh, she does conceive. Okay? Then Luke has Mary have this annunciation. An angel comes to Mary and says, you're going to conceive. And she said, I'm a virgin. I haven't been there yet. That can't happen. And he says, you're going to conceive and have a child. And Mary says the same thing. How can this be? But she says, so be it unto me. She believes it. Okay. Now, we can talk about what virgin means. You talked about young girl, and that Matthew uses the language of virgin. Virgin was also a narrative construction that was used to talk about really important people. Okay? So it has nothing to do with the physiological condition of a woman. It was a narratival construction. So, but in Luke's case, both are operative. But in Luke's case, what he's saying is, this is a virgin, but she is going to conceive. Again, how can this be? How can I conceive? Okay, how is this possible? It's like the shepherds. The shepherds got the message about Jesus. They're outcasts. How can they be given this empowering message? They're marginalized. Exactly Luke's point. Luke's message is to the marginalized, the outcast, the poor, the non-Jewish. It's like you have a part in this coming of a new world, of new possibilities, of new engagement, of new life. This can happen to you. You are participants in new life where you didn't even think it was possible. That's really great storytelling. Okay. So, and in Mary, as you all know, the Magnificat comes out of the Gospel of Luke. It's like, it's just it's a beautiful song of praise and empowerment. The lowly will be lifted up, and who am I? Who am I that this should happen? But, it's reflective of a song in the Hebrew Bible from Hannah. So his audience, some Jewish, some Gentile, would have resonances of that. And then, anyway, something else I want to mention about Luke is that for almost every story there is about a man, there's a story about a woman. It's really unusual. You don't see that in the other Gospels. If there's a parable about a woman losing a coin, there's a parable about a man and so on. So, yeah. Exactly. So in Luke, and by the way, Luke could have been written as late as 120. He could have been written as late as 120. So Luke comes much later needless to say, after Jesus' execution. So this is all storytelling after the fact. This is a way of telling the story to an early Christian community who's becoming more diverse, to encourage them to stay engaged and continue to be part of this mission for the kingdom of God, which is a very different way than the kingdom of Caesar. Okay? But Luke appeals to a different audience. He uses very different storyline to get people engaged. And just as you were saying about Matthew, I mean, this is really riveting storytelling. But is it actual history? I mean, are we supposed to throw out that story if it's like, nah, it was wise men, it wasn't shepherds? We've missed the point. Or it's like, well, was he in a manger? Well, if he wasn't in a manger, you've missed the point. What's consistent is Mary, Joseph, Herod. Okay? But everything, it's like, why is the story told this way? And who's telling the story? And to whom? Those are really important questions as we look at the birth narratives or any of the stories in the New Testament. But anyway, I think that Luke also a very different take on this, very different emphasis. But his story is really distinct. And let me also say this, what you said, which I think is so spot on, that some of the themes that are identified in the birth narratives are foretastes of the themes that will continue throughout the gospel. So in the gospel, in the birth narrative in Matthew, if you kind of get some of those themes, and you handle that so beautifully by saying, and to the ends of the earth, because that's how Matthew's gospel ends. That's part of the message here, is this is a light for the whole world. You'll get some of those themes in the birth narratives. Same thing in Luke. A lot of the themes around the marginalized, the presence of the Holy Spirit. Luke refers to the Holy Spirit more than any other gospel. He's saying to the early communities, there's a spirit here that could help to guide you. And the prominence of women, and named women in Luke. Okay? That's very different than in Matthew. Okay? But those themes that show up in the birth narratives in Luke, those continue to be themes of revolution and emancipation and liberation in Luke. That's very important for Luke's gospel. The inaugural address in Luke, he borrows from Isaiah. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to bring deliverance to the captives, to set the captive free. So Luke is saying to you marginalized, you who don't feel like you're in the in club, you who don't know this stuff, we want you to be part of us too. And Matthew is, in the inaugural address of Jesus in Matthew, is the Beatitudes, which, as I said, is an intensification of the law.
The law given on Sinai.
But they are different inaugural addresses. Does that mean that, well, then who's right? That's not the question. Okay? So the way the story is told and what this is fabulous. I don't think the early hearers of the gospel ever thought they were listening to quote-unquote history. So for us in the 21st century, to try to literalize these stories or fact-check them misses the importance and I think the power and quote-unquote truth of these narratives. That makes sense?
Makes sense to me. What time is it now?
It's too late. It's late. It's late, but it's not too late. Are you willing to hang in there for another 10 minutes? Yeah. You willing to do that? And for those who need to leave, let
me just make
yes.
two quick thoughts. One is...
I'm sorry about going late.
It's impressive to me that people can look at the same set of data and come to different conclusions. And Marianne and I have about Matthew's gospel. I still believe, and despite what you've said, that Matthew is much less concerned about imperial Rome. Judaism was a licit religion. It was legal. They did not have to sacrifice to the genius of the emperor. They did not have to undergo Roman pantheistic rituals. They were exempted from those. And therefore, Judaism was not as subject to the oppressive functions of Rome as some people were, although it was an occupied country. There's no question about that. And in fact, Orthodox Judaism had come to terms with Rome in some regards, particularly temple-based Judaism. The titles, Prince of Peace, Lord of Lords, King of Kings, and so forth, are more sparse on the ground in Matthew than they are in Luke. They are all over the place. They're all over the place in Luke. I agree with you completely. Luke, I think, is absolutely anti-imperial. He's contrasting Jesus and Caesar, absolutely contrasting the two. I still don't think that was a terribly important thing. The reason why Herod is the only king mentioned in Luke's story, the first person mentioned is Caesar. Caesar Augustus decides to have a census or a tax, depending on what version you know. Yeah. Caesar's never mentioned in Matthew's gospel. Herod is a Jewish king. Right. The battle is between which one of us is the king of the Jews. Right. And Herod, but it's not a battle between Rome and Jesus. It's a battle between Herod, Jewish king, and Jesus.
Even though Matthew was written in 80 or 85.
Understandably, right, exactly. But that's the fight going on. That's the fight going on there. Is who needs to capture the hearts of Judaism? We're after the hearts of Judaism here. And that's why I think that Matthew is less concerned about Rome. Luke, I'm absolutely sure, is deeply concerned to contrast Rome and Jesus. And I think Matthew is concerned to contrast not Rome, but the Jewish power structure. So so I agree that there's a political element to this. It's just I think the politics is different. Yeah. I just don't think Rome is terribly important to Matthew in the same way it seems clearly to be to Luke.
And you know what's so fun about this? We said last time, there's no one quote-unquote progressive Christianity. There's never been one Christianity. There's not one Buddhism. There's not one Islam. There's not, There's
not one way of reading the Bible either.
That's exactly right. Yeah. And so, we're talking here as though it's like, this is it, whatever. It's conversation, believe it or not.
So what's our question?
The question is I am curious to know, from how we've talked about these stories, where you see yourself in these stories. Where do you see yourself in these stories? I mean, are you like Zechariah saying, I don't believe it, and wait and see? Are you like Mary saying, I don't know how anything new can be, but be it unto me and according to you? Are you like Herod, who wants to preserve what's familiar in terms of power structures? Because, it's not that bad. Do we see ourselves like the wise men who follow a light and decide not to return to Herod? Are we like the shepherds? Are we marginalized? Do we feel like we don't have a voice? We're nothing in this plan. We're poor. We're outcast. Who am I to be part of the kingdom of God? I mean, where do we see ourselves in this story? And remember that these stories were told at a time of calamity, and yet they are talking about the possibilities of a new way of being in the world and in relationship with one another.
I myself feel sheepish.
Okay.
There you go.
Perfect. It's like, you know what? I don't know that any of these stories speak to me particularly. Fair enough.
I feel like,
Fair enough. Here's another one over here.
Judy.
I wasn't going to say this, but when you said sheepish, I just want to put into perspective how important it is that our God, the Christian God, is the God of history. That God meets us where we're at personally, but the story of the Bible is also God meeting God's people where they're at, the people of Israel. So history is really important to me. in the way I read the Bible. And also, my way of overcoming fundamentalism, which was proof texting all through my high school and early life, was a way of dealing with trying to overcome the dualism. And I wanted, therefore, to emphasize the history, the real live people on the ground walking instead of the heaven afterlife. So while I was in Santa Fe, I've traveled this continent as a wanderer among Christianity because of being a lesbian, which, talk about a death. When I realized I was a lesbian as a fundamentalist, there was no room for me in my own worldview. So I had to go through a complete death of that world and then replace it. So history was comforting to me to think of all the stories in the Bible of people, real live people with feet on the ground. And at the same time, when I attended Bill's church and the what's it called again? The study, the EFM. What does that stand for anyway?
Education for Ministry.
Education for Ministers. Okay. I started understanding how to read my life as a metaphor. And how to read, I'm a real life person on the ground, and when I tell my story, I am referencing something bigger than bones and flesh. Okay, so when I was in Santa Fe, there was this, every city has a way of talking. And in Santa Fe, everybody, when you go to a party, they want to know, what's your sign? What's your rising sign? And I knew all that. I made sure that I was covered. But the part of that just really struck me was when they said, well, who do you think you were in your last life? Okay, so this...
Everybody was Nefertiti, I thought.
Yeah. You're on the same wavelength. You see, so when you ask the question, who are you in this story? I'm reminded of the people in Santa Fe who said, who were you in this past life?
Interesting.
Okay? And what I heard from people in Santa Fe was that there were fundamentalists who really, really did believe that they were an Egyptian priestess in ancient Egypt, and they had a whole story about that, and it was real to them. And then I met other people who were a little more ecumenical about their reincarnation beliefs, and they said, it really doesn't matter if it's true or not. It's how you feel. It's who are you? If you did live in the past, who would you be? And this comes back to Cake, who said sheepish. Okay, are you with me? So, back to the question, who are you in this story? Kate said sheepish. I went to Santa Fe thinking this is just like the story of reincarnation. Who would I feel most like in this story? And it would be the cow who gave up the manger, looking for the food, and that there's this human baby, cute, but gosh, I'm hungry. So, and even though that's comical, really, if my feeling for that cow is couched in my absolute love and regard for the creation, and that there were animals present at Jesus' birth is a really important part of the story for me. Thank you.
Thank you. And I know we're past time. So, no, that's perfectly all right. It's actually my error because I need to pay more attention to the time. Let me tell you briefly what our topic is going to be next time. Our next gathering is January 12th. Come, bring a friend. We are going to talk about mysticism. Okay? It's the liturgical season of Epiphany, which Epiphany means that which has been hidden becomes manifest, becomes visible, surfaces. So, but next time we're going to talk about mysticism And as you might remember from our session last time, I'm all for democratizing mysticism. Right. I don't want to make it this esoteric stuff, but we will be exploring that together next time, January 12th. So thank you. There's so much more to be said about what we've helped to unpack today. But in closing, 2 quotes that I will use every time we are together. One from Mary Oliver. When it's over, or to borrow from the title of the poem from which this comes, when death comes, I want to say, all my life, I was a bride married to amazement. I was the bridegroom taking the world into my arms. From Stephen Hawking. Try to make sense of what you have seen and wonder about what makes the universe exist. It matters you don't give up. Unleash your imagination. Shape the future. A line from Denise Levertov. Aren't there annunciations of one sort or another in most lives? Aren't there annunciations of one sort or another in most lives? My invitation to you is, what is yours? And to close, from Henri Bergson. The future is no longer what is going to happen. It is, what are we going to do? The future is no longer what is going to happen. It is, what are you going to do? Thank you for being here today.
Thank you very much for being here.